This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Biko Caruthers, Assistant Professor and Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of English at New York University. His work engages with visual art, literature and history, and the theoretical and readerly possibilities of Afro-pessimism. In this conversation, we explore the origins and political significance of Black studies, the complex relationship between insurgent work in the field and the institutionalization of departments and professorial life, and how pessimist theory opens new horizons for reading historical texts and intervening in moments of cultural and political violence. Hello, Biko. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Really excited to have a chance to talk with you today. We've crossed paths multiple times when you were working on your dissertation or doctoral work at University of Massachusetts Amherst. I was at Amherst College. We were in events and in the town, and just really excited to have a chance to actually sit down and talk and have you contribute to this series, but also just hear a lot more about your thinking. And really appreciate you making the time for it. It's the beginning of the semester, so I know this is like a wild time. So
this is a good time to ask me at the beginning.
That's true. Before papers start rolling in,
yeah.
Always better. And I will just say, because I think it's worth saying, congratulations on finishing your dissertation. You mentioned as we were chatting before, that you're just over a month in. It's a huge deal. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Caruthers.
Absolutely, yes.
I want to get into hearing about your work and how you think about your work in relation to the past and future of Black studies. But I thought even before we get into thinking about the field and thinking about your work, I wanted to really just invite you to narrate for us how you came to the field, what got you interested in Black studies, what drew you to the study of Black life, and always for me, like what sustains you there? Because, anyone who just finished a dissertation knows something has to sustain you because you get tired, right? Mm-hmm. So what drew you in? What keeps you here?
Okay. I will start by saying what led me to the academy was definitely questions around anti-Black violence, revolutionary violence, and the violence of Western lies. And I know sometimes when people ask the question about, narrate your intellectual journey, there's like a starting point. And I don't know if you want me to talk about undergrad, but I would actually like to take it back a little bit further.
I say take it all the way back. We've had folks talking about, bookshelves that they remember from their first days, so I think these are important stories to tell. So.
Okay. Yeah. So I would definitely say that as a product of public schools in Cleveland, Ohio, and a teacher at public school districts in Oklahoma City, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Houston, Texas, those roles and being in school as a student, growing up, and also inform the questions and animate my thinking about the academy and the world. And, in taking it back, I would like to go back to my time as an 8th grader at Memorial Junior High, because I think we have the time. So
absolutely. Was this in Cleveland?
Yes, this was in Cleveland. And so I know yesterday was 9/11, and that was, for me, 23 years ago, if my math is correct. I was in 8th grade, and I was in Mr. Dunn's class. And I remember that day specifically because, Mr. Dunn was my history teacher. The next period, I'm in Miss Simon's classroom in 8th grade science, and Mr. Dunn runs in, and he's like, "Hey, a tower just hit the World Trade Center." And I was like, "Well, what's the World Trade Center?" I'd never heard of it before. I said, "Okay, I guess something bad has happened." And then we find out that a second tower was struck. And so now there's like fear animating and kind of circulating around, 8th grade students, and parents are coming and picking up their students from school. My parents are unable to pick me up, so I had to walk home that day. But I just remember being really scared and looking up at the sky as I'm walking home, because by then at the end of the school day, we had heard that, 4 planes had been hijacked. And so, of course, going to school over the next couple of weeks, eighth graders, they have questions and they're going to ask their history teacher to help them make sense of what they saw on what they are seeing on the news and what they're hearing on the news. And so Mr. Dunn, being the great teacher that he was, he actually stopped teaching U.S. history and took the time to try to teach us something about the Middle East. And so he did some extra work and found out about, U.S. involvement in the Middle East, the Taliban, Afghanistan, just context, giving us some context, giving us something, right? And I found that to be really, really helpful. And I'm going to bookmark that and just say, that teacher specifically had a huge impact on my life. And so moving forward into high school, I'm now in 10th grade. And this all connects to, the questions I mentioned earlier, questions around anti-Black violence, questions around revolutionary violence, and of course the violence of Western lies. And so now I'm in 10th grade, and Mr. Harkey, my AP US history teacher, has assigned additional reading to go along with the APUSH textbook. And at the time it was The American Pageant. And so on that reading list, he had works like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, The Grapes of Wrath, and I think that's Steinbeck. And one book in particular caught my eye. It was Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. And that's the book I wanted to read. And so, I still have the book today.
I think that book is probably illegal in a number of school districts.
Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
sorry, go on.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I still have this book to this very day. And I was just looking at it this morning, and just, some of the chapters, the true importance of Christopher Columbus, the truth about the first Thanksgiving, Gone with the Wind, the invisible racism in American history textbooks, like all of that to say, that book was it shaped my thinking about American history and the world, and okay, some lying has been going on. And so all that to say, my high school, my time in Northeastern Ohio, I'm taking art classes. And in my mind, I am wanting to be, at this point, junior in high school. I'm not thinking about teaching specifically, but I am thinking about art, and I'm wanting to be comic book artist or, a animator. And so I'm enrolled in AP Art for my senior year, but unfortunately for me, my parents, my dad's a preacher, and so we moved to North Carolina, and I'm in AP Art in the South now, and this teacher, blonde hair, blue eyes, did not think that I had the skills to be in the course, and so she had me removed, and I was placed in a commercial art class, and I gave up on being an artist, and I settled on being a teacher. And so I'm now in my undergrad career. I go to Southwestern Christian College, and then I transfer to Oklahoma Christian University to get my degree in social studies education. And, as I'm at Oklahoma Christian University, I'm taking, of course, courses with professors who are, conservative, they're white, and they are teaching U.S. history in a way that doesn't really talk about Black people. So I made a point to research to find some Black people to write about for my papers. And so I was writing about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, because that's all that I knew from my, time as a high school student and undergrad. And so eventually I become a middle school teacher. I start teaching in 2011, that fall. And by 2012, Trayvon Martin has been murdered. And of course, my students, I'm their history teacher, and I'm thinking back to Mr. Dunn, when something happens and your students want to know about current events, they come to the history teacher. And so students are asking me, oh, did you hear about Trayvon Martin? They haven't arrested the guy, and what can we do? And I saw on Twitter, people have been calling the police department. So let's call the police department. So we try to call the police department during lunch. That doesn't go. And then students asked if they can bring in Skittle wrappers, and we put them on the chalkboard. And of course, I get an administrator approaching me. Hey, Mr. Caruthers, we need you to come to my office during your planning period. And so I go, and they're telling me, hey, I'm concerned because parents are concerned about what you're talking about or discussing with students in your class. And I said, well, you're just talking about, Trayvon Martin, and, he was murdered. This is wrong. And, they kind of told me I needed to stop in the nicest way possible. And, I didn't make a big deal of it, but, I kept teaching. And if you remember in the 2010s, you have the rise of Black Lives Matter. You have, we're seeing Sandra Bland, Mike Brown, Corinne Gaines, all these, Black people, Tamir Rice, that are being murdered by police. And so, by 2014, I'm so disillusioned with quote unquote America. I am refusing. I'm now teaching high school. I'm refusing to stand up for the pledge. I'm not making my students stand up because I'm seeing violence on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm not standing. And of course, an administrator approaches me, hey, Mr. Caruthers, we're getting some complaints about The fact that you are not standing for the pledge, you're the history teacher, you're not making students stand for the pledge, and you're also, being really critical of America and police, in your lessons. And I was like, oh, I'm tired of this. I need to find something else. And so I'm talking to my parents, and my dad's like, hey, maybe staging a protest in front of high school students isn't something you should be doing. Maybe you should go try to teach college. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go be a professor. I can talk about Black people, And so that puts me on the path into entering into the academy. And eventually, I come to UMass Amherst and start the PhD in Afro-American Studies. And I am approaching it with questions initially about the Black arts movement. I did a master's before in history before I came to UMass, and I was interested in the Black arts movement, James Baldwin and Mary Baraka. And, Jane Smethurst at UMass Amherst is like one of the greatest scholars with the Black arts movement.
I was going to say, great place for that. Yeah. Sonia Sanchez just wandering in and out of Amherst.
Absolutely. And James Baldwin taught there for a bit as well. And so, I was at the place, and I took a course with Britt Russard, who became my dissertation chair in literary theory. And this is the first time I'm reading Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and I'm reading Scenes of Subjection by Saidiya Hartman. I'm reading some Frank Wilderson essays and some articles, and that just blew my mind, because here I'm able to now think critically about violence in a way that I hadn't before. And so I started to use Afro-pessimism as the lens to approach, my coursework. And so I'm going to feminist theory with Professor Shaw with Afro-pessimism on my mind. I'm going to, South African literature with Professor Klingman with Afro-pessimism on my mind. I'm approaching Caribbean cultural theory with Professor Mordecai with Afro-pessimism on my mind. And so, just that was it, what eventually led to me using, Afro-pessimism as a lens throughout my dissertation. So that's how I have arrived. And to your question about what keeps me here, I will say, when I was imagining myself as a professor, I would tell people, I would like to be a professor in New York City and kind of have these really dope outfits and just be in the city and just attend all these events. And so I would say,
you're a cluster of dope outfits away.
Yeah. And so I'm in the city, and I'm able to, I was at the Schomburg last night for an event, and I'm able to go to things in the area and kind of connect with people who are thinking about Black life, Black culture, and Black studies. And I really am energized by the community of scholars and the community of and the community members who are thinking about Black people. And so that's what sustains me going to those events around the city of New York.
Yeah, that's it's so funny. First of all, there's a lot of richness to that. So you got to hold on to the middle-aged memoir idea.
Yeah,
because that's. I was trying to. I think anytime, especially people who work with literature and film, I was trying to anticipate the twists and turns of the story, and I did not see a lot of these, but it is really interesting the way the refusal to let you do the very thing that changed your life as a young person, as a teacher. The refusal to let you do that, right, led you to become a professor who's in a position to do those things, right, and write those things that will then be potentially, in the hands of a future 8th grade teacher that you had, or that you wanted to be and couldn't quite be. Now that's a wild journey, and UMass is such an interesting place for you to have ended up. As you were telling that story, I was like, I don't know if UMass helped organize, if that Afro-American Studies program helped organize your sort of interpretation of your past, or if it was like the past really just sort of fated you to be in this place that could sustain all these aspects of what you're interested in.
Yeah, I'm grateful to be here.
Or to have been there. So let me ask you then about the field of Black Studies, right? That's your PhD, and I'm always interested in talking with in this podcast with people who come to Black Studies in different kinds of ways. And you're somebody who comes to Black Studies through your PhD work, right? And so in thinking about the field, which is now 50 plus years old, and your graduate degree is from one of the first 2 or 3 graduate degree or offering institutions in the field. So when we think about the meaning of, right, how we imagine the shape of Black studies, its contents, its imperative, its prescriptions, and so forth, right? For me, it's always interesting to think about that in relationship to its past, to its origins. And it has that double origin of the demand to have a presence on campus and a representation on campus of Black intellectual life, of Black intellectual traditions, which were lacking in the disciplines. So Black studies steps in to serve that role, right? To fundamentally alter how we think about intellectual life. But it also, of course, comes at that time of radical Black liberation struggle, especially in the Bay Area, in San Francisco State, which was also trying to reconfigure both the relationship between campuses and communities and the relationship between intellectual work and radical political struggle. And those two things, I mean, they go hand in hand, but they also don't hold hands. They also have different kinds of imperatives. We're 55-something years out. Many things have changed since the late 1960s. Many things remain the same. So I'm curious how you, sort of in the context of that origin story of Black studies, how you imagine the field today.
So what I'm hearing is you're asking how do I think about the field of Black studies today?
Yeah, and how do you see it in relation to these imperatives of intellectual tradition development, but also political responsibility and liberation struggle?
Oh, okay. I can answer that. So I would start by saying that I do see Black studies as being, part of that ongoing and necessary critique of Western thought, of Western ways of knowing, perhaps defining and making a world, and also a refusal about the ways in which knowledge is made to labor in the service of a world sustained by New World slavery. And so I see the field and would like to continue to see it as a conversation between Black thinkers and Black writers with each other and at times with other fields. And I would like to continue to see a commitment to identifying the stakes and recognizing the ground from which we think and labor on or relies on or is founded on or indebted to, or, we have it because there have been lies told about Black people and about, different other groups of people, but specifically Black people, because, thinking about Black studies. Earlier this year, I was reading Joshua Myers of Black Study. And he, in his introduction, he's talking about June Jordan, and he's talking about, these intellectual traditions that are founded on lies. And I also remember, thinking back to coursework, being in major works in Afro-American studies and learning with John Bracey, and just, how he would talk about historians of slavery and how some of those famous early historians of American history, they studied slavery. And there's a whole historiography of, how the history of slavery was used to present a worldview that, slavery was beneficial to Black people. And so just thinking about those two things together. And then, of course, going back to Myers' text, where he talks about, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, there are, bad faith, and then there's like, a whole collection of interests that are served by those who need those lies. And then he ends with, and this is a quote, I wrote this down. In other words, asking what produces the lie rather than what constitutes the lie is a more necessary response than simply refuting the lie. For the lie, this capacity for lying, is the very idea of the West. And to me, that is, what Black studies is and should be about, or Black study. And, if I could offer a personal anecdote, related to these things and how I am seeing it apply to my life in and outside of the academy. I moved from Houston, Texas, to New York City, and, a partner and I, we are driving in a U-Haul across the United States, and we're driving for 4 to 5 hours and then getting up the next day. And I'm so thankful that she was able to help me drive, because, I fall asleep while I drive and I can't really drive by myself. But all that to say,
I'm sorry, only 4 or 5 hours a day?
Yes. You
young people are weak, man.
No.
Come on.
No,
10 hours.
Well, so
anyway, sorry.
No, it's fine. We get to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and it's next morning we're eating the continental breakfast, and I don't watch the news anymore. And I'm my ears are on, but I'm focused on the cinnamon roll that I'm eating, and I hear on the news, the school year just started in this particular district, and we're having incidents of anti-Semitism. And I'm like, okay, so what are they about to show? So I turn and look at the TV, and what they show is free Palestine, free Gaza. And I was just, again, this just lies the media tells. And so like, I'm finding myself currently, I'm finding myself interested in kind of connecting or highlighting, how genres of science fiction and fantasy are energized and reliant on histories of slavery and genocide and conquest, and how repression is an element in those in the mediums of film and comics. And so I'm thinking specifically, I'm going to name myself as a millennial and also as a close reader and also a fan of, I have a Harry Potter tattoo on my arm, but, I have distanced myself from J.K. Rowling's beliefs on trans people. But like, I came of age reading Harry Potter. And I specifically remember in 2003, before my sophomore year, asking my father to go to Barnes & Noble and get Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. And I don't know if you are initiated into the world of Harry Potter, but in the 5th book, the students are really wanting to learn defense against the dark arts. And, the Ministry of Magic is scared that Dumbledore is building an army because Voldemort has come back in the 4th book. And they appoint this Professor Umbridge, and she becomes like this educational inquistador. And there's all these, these edicts or what have you, notices about like how, students can learn, and they're not able to assemble, they're not able to learn, and all that to say, like, I don't like, I grew up reading those things, and then I'm seeing, of course, that Barnard College has announced that professors cannot post things on their door that express support of a geopolitical position. And so like, just all those things to say, like, I see Black studies as needing to provide a critique of culture, a critique of popular culture. We need to have conversations about celebrity. We need to have conversations about the things that are big and how they are reliant on those histories. I think also, if you track, I love Beyonce to a certain extent. I'm not going to say that. Scratch that. Edit that out. No. I think if you were to track Beyonce's albums alongside Black Studies, you'll know in 2013, she had that self-titled Beyonce album, and she's talking about, hey, I'm a feminist. And then in 2016, you have Beyonce's Lemonade. And then, of course, in that Formation video, you have the imagery of like the Black Lives Matter protest. And earlier that year in 2016, you have the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, and she's in that revolutionary garb for the Super Bowl. And then, of course, 8 years later, we have Cowboy Carter, and she's with the American flag. And this, of course, is against the backdrop of genocides in Sudan and genocides in Palestine that are ongoing, and nothing from her on that. And then also, within the last week, Kendrick Lamar, who has, taken Drake to task and called him out for his relationship to the South, specifically Atlanta, and now he's posing in front of the American flag. And so I would like to see Black folks in conversation about how celebrity has been used, and celebrity itself, Black celebrities is in a way parasitic on Black histories of struggle, and they use that as like a currency and a way to be hip and cool and to cash in on that without meeting, request for, I don't want to say solidarity, but using their platforms to speak out, and also not necessarily saying that we need them to speak out, but who knows what would happen if Beyonce were to say something about Palestine or, Taylor Swift, who knows, so I would like to see, Black studies to be in conversation, a deeper conversation besides, being a fan of these people, but, really take them to task and critique them. And, in the spirit of Bell Hooks, right? Bell Hooks has some really good critiques of Beyonce that, people, a lot of people did not like. Beyonce's a terrorist. And so, let's talk about that. And so, so I'll stop there.
It's interesting. It's interesting because it to be intro podcast with references, one of my podcast conversation with Kianga Taylor, one of the things that she brought up, this is a later sort of question that I'm interested in hearing you talk about, but sort of, how, some version of like, how is Black studies different? What's its future? And she was like, we have to actually continue to ask the question of the Black and Black studies, because the Black and Black studies in 1970 is going to actually be a different Black and than the Black and Black studies now, right? For the reasons you're talking about, the emergence of the Black political class, the Black middle class, changes in college accessibility and so forth, and the changes of celebrity, right? I mean,
Right.
Black artists have been celebrities, since the early 1960s in terms of the national stage, but this level of like billionaire and culture shifter, like with one album or even one tweet. But, in addition to sort of critical relationships to particular figures, there's also this question that I see sort of, I don't want to say lurking in the background because you've actually outright said it, and it really harkens back to, your first thing about arriving at UMass and reading Hartman in particular, about the way the idea of Blackness is shifting in its relation to empire, to hegemony, and to power. And how does that make us think the Black in Black studies is? I think that's a hard question because certainly I think a lot of the formation of Black studies has been to elevate the Black in Black studies in all ways possible. Obviously, there are internal debates. There are good guys, bad guys, and all these debates.
Right.
But this level of critique you're talking about, I think, is going to parse out that relationship and that notion of what Blackness even means in Black studies in really interesting new ways. Yeah, I don't know. I know I'm sort of riffing on what you said. But I think that level of critique really does kind of go beyond like the individuals, and it's like, what does it mean that you mentioned Taylor Swift, but and Drake has become abject since this rap battle, but Drake, and you can list off all these people who shape our social and cultural worlds.
Yeah.
And what it would mean to enter into critique might be beyond the person. It might be beyond capitalism. It might be to add these appreciation of these new dimensions of what the Black in Black studies is.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were talking about like elevating the Black, I wonder like if, for Black and within Black studies, like, is that elevation just simply representation? Because I see people and I've heard, I've, been levied these critiques myself about representation. Like we need to move beyond being enamored by being the first Black in this position or having representation in empire. We should want more. We should want beyond that. We should not want to be participants in reforming empire or shoring up empire by allowing ourselves to be recruited into being the Black president or the first Black what have you, because it's all got to go. If you take these theorists seriously and like these conclusions seriously, like, we got to clear it out.
And that goes to, what you were citing from Josh's book about, it's the refuting the lie, right? Taking on the particular figure, the particular claim is very different than the reason for the lie, right? And what does this moment mean in terms of all of that? Yeah, so we got to come back and rejoin this conversation. Ashley and I were talking about a sort of second wave of these podcasts, sort of pulling people together around themes, right? Pedagogy, representation, power, et cetera. And I think this opens up so many cultural questions and so many political questions. We could do our whole podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And bring in a lot of really great people. Well, let me ask about your work. I mean, we're talking about the field and politics and culture broadly, but ask about your work in particular. That's a great thing about having finished your dissertation is now you can say my work rather than my dissertation.
Yeah,
I really do think that's the biggest transition in addition to
absolutely.
a real paycheck. But it's an interesting mix for me of critical theory, of literary study, and of course visual culture. And there's just so many insights in each of those, but especially when combined, so many insights into Black life to be generated. So I'm interested in you thinking about and reflecting on your own work and research program, how you see it in relation to the past of Black studies, but also how you see it opening up new horizons for the field.
Okay. So to answer these questions, I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of my work, which is now a book project, right? No longer a dissertation. So I'm going to start with what I do in my work. And of course I defended my dissertation a little over a month ago, thank God. But in my work, I'm broadly interested in how Black writers and artists have responded to anti-Blackness. And so within that response, there is a question and a critique about the category of the human. And I argue, one of my arguments in my work is that the Black child is one of the most important symbolic constructs under modernity, because if man is now the center, and needs to maintain its coherence, it requires the figure of the Black child. And I read and analyze and discuss man as the quote unquote adult of the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment's crowning achievement. And the Black child is in an abusive relationship with this adult, a parasitic, a vampiric relationship with this figure. And so in chapter one of my work in my book project, I close read
good
Harriet E. Wilson's Arnig, and that's a story about a Black girl named Fredo, who was born in New England to a white mother and a Black father, and she's left with this white family, the Belmonts, and she's there as a servant, but they're also abusing her. And so throughout this text, Wilson, who was also born to a white mother and a Black father, raised in New England, uses Fredo to raise questions about slavery's shadows as they also are cast up north. And of course, slavery being not an experience, but how people are relating to Black people. And so Fredo, this character, has to contend with, white womanhood, the white family, and Christianity, which is another way of using this figure, Fredo, to raise questions about the category of the human. And so that's, the first chapter. And then in the later chapters, I'm looking at Toni Morrison's first two novels and how she takes up girlhood and womanhood, and Sula and The Bluest Eye, and the critiques that she's raising against the quote unquote Black family and the assurances it's supposed to provide. And then I'm close reading The Autobiography of My Mother by Jamaica Kincaid, which is doing something similar with Xuela, the main character, and just thinking about colonialism and like a post-colonial world. And then there's chapter 4 where I'm thinking of Basquiat as he thought of himself as also, an artist and also a writer, and just looking at his visual text and what he's saying through satire and dark humor about the art world, Western art history, and the category of the human. And so that is the project. I would like to add, a component where I'm discussing and taking up, Tupac and what he has to say in his origins, like with his mother, and how she was, part of the Black Panthers, and like what he was saying, about anti-Black violence in his songs. I think it's Latasha, the young girl who was killed by the Korean store owner. He referenced her, I think, about 4 of his songs. And so I'm interested in including, a discussion about music and within that as well. And so that's how that's my work. But like, how do I see it in relation to the past and Black studies? Having an interdisciplinary approach, not just focusing on the literature, incorporating, in UMass Amherst, I was on the literature and culture track. And so I'm interested in talking, not only novels and like text, but like art and music, and how all of those work together to have this critique about anti-Blackness and this critique about anti-Blackness. And, the question about, New Horizons. I would say, I use Afro-pessimism as like my lens, one of my main, critical theories, meta theories within my close readings of these texts. And I would say I'm doing something different in the sense that I'm using Afro-pessimism to close read Toni Morrison and some of our favorites in African American, literature. And people may have, things to say about that. But, Wilderson talks about, reading, James Baldwin against their humanistic impulses and kind of reading them against, what they are saying about revolutionary violence. And so I find that work to be really interesting and invigorating. And so that's how I see myself and like my work within the umbrella that is Black Studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Afro-pessimism as like a debate about like good or bad. It's interesting to think about. And I think at this point, it's almost canonical, things move fast, but, I think it helps that Afro-pessimism and Afro-pessimists have been really loud and present, right? It's a way of inserting themselves in the tradition in a really strong way. But Afro-pessimism as a methodology for reading, I love that. I think like, look, I know it's been a month, but you got to hurry up and get this book out. This is completely interesting. like I really love this. I really love this idea. And it's I was also listening to, I was thinking it's an eclectic collection of texts too. It's not, because it's not a diasporic consideration as a book, but it does have Jamaica Kincaid in there, along with Toni Morrison, like two writers who are in their own way very national, but very different nations. So yeah, I love that, and I think if Afro-pessimism can move from are they the good guys or the bad guys to like a way of reading, to a way of thinking, to a way of organizing objects, I really love that. I think that's of the new horizons I'm looking forward to, that might be the most generally. So I'm glad you're doing that. You're in a good position to do it. Let me ask you, this is related in some ways. Your PhD, as you said, was in a Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst, and now you're in an English department at New York University. And so that's moving from an area study to a discipline, right? From multidisciplinary research to, English it's a discipline.
Yeah.
It's also kind of not. I have my own thoughts on that as a fellow part-time English professor. But nevertheless, that's a movement. And I'm curious, because you did literary studies in Afro-American studies, and now you're going to be doing Black studies in an English department. How do you think that movement between area studies and disciplinary work is going to impact, or has impacted, your thinking and your writing, and also thinking in the present, this semester, but also going forward, how it changes your approach to classrooms?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I will say, like, I initially came to the academy wanting to be a historian of sorts, maybe a literary historian. And so, there was the disciplining there. But of course, as I took, courses at UMass Amherst, and like as I was writing my first master's thesis, I found that I was like not necessarily discussing James Baldwin's Another Country or Mary Baraka's plays as primary sources. I was discussing them as works of literature, and so I need to just go full tilt into literary studies. And so yeah, absolutely right. And so I made that shift when I got to UMass. Right now I am in the English department at NYU, and I am enjoying it, and I'm excited to see how it's going to impact my thinking. Right now I'm teaching a graduate course titled Monsters, Laboratories, and the Black Child, where we are mostly, thinking about the 19th century, and, we're asking questions about the connections between, why is Bram Stoker writing Dracula, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, and how does slavery and anti-blackness inform the creation of these, Halloween's coming up, these what we call these Halloween monsters, these famous, almost franchises, and the things that we see movies about. Like, so how are these things related to the 19th century, specifically slavery and like the plantation? And so that's what I'm doing in the English department. So we are reading, of course, those novels, and I'm learning with my students about how to talk and think about literature. I was in the English department at Rice University as well as a visiting lecturer last school year, and I will say like my training is it's in history, it's in social studies education, and so for me to make this shift in my PhD, I would say I feel like there may be a few blind spots I have when it comes to how I approach literature, but I like the fact that I am able to close read it, and I'm also able to do it. I'm also, I have mentors within the English department here at NYU, and I'm interested to see and learn from people who, think of themselves as English professors. And so, I see that, in thinking about research and thinking about other things that I want to bring into my book, and like other things I want to write about, I find that, pushing the needle, or kind of pushing us to see, there's poetry, there's novels, there's essays, but like just seeing other things that can be text, looking at, I like the phrase visual text. I like that I think about Basquiat as a writer, because he also thought of himself as a writer. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to make movies. And so I see, pushing how we think about text and like what we close read. I would like to experiment with that. And I'm also interested in like I'm interested in comic books too, and in close reading that, and like using that as something to and that may be a different project. I don't know if it'll fit in with my current project, but I'm interested in like incorporating, studying comic books, and like specifically like the X-Men, and how that metaphor of the mutant is reliant on a parasitic relationship to Black liberation and Black struggle. And so I want to think about those things as works of literature as well.
Yeah, Kiana Whitted's work on comics and race is really interesting. I actually just did a podcast with her this week, so you should listen into that.
Yeah,
Her
absolutely.
works. There's, when you talking about different ways of reading and different ways of even thinking about what a text is. I mean, that's what, I found myself in moving between disciplines, previously in a discipline, philosophy, and then into Black studies, and now being split between Black studies and English, is just even what comprises a text for a classroom, what comprises a text in research. In Black studies, it's in the best sense, it's anarchy. Right, the world is an archive, right? Except for the most rigid among us. And as you move into disciplines, there's a little bit more of a struggle and a battle. But I always think those are worth fighting. But also because you can learn that people aren't naive, right, about what they think comprises, say, a literary text.
Yeah.
They got real thoughts about it, and I love that. Like, let me learn from, but also let me push boundaries. I mean, that's always been my approach, and
Right.
I feel like everything I write and everything I teach is so informed by that, because it's one thing to sort of be anti-disciplinary and the world is an archive, but there's something really invigorating about being pushed on that.
Right,
and,
right.
And challenged, and other people are smart and have insight too in other disciplines. But you've already, as you said, you came in really interested in history and literary history, and so that those ideas of how to assemble archives and make meaning is definitely like sort of baked into the foundations of your own education and sensibilities.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, let me ask. This is a sort of speculative question, not really a speculative question, but a sort of question of reckoning with the field. What do you think in its history, 50-something years, what do you think Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done so well?
Well, I definitely want to give an honest and thoughtful answer. So I will say, sitting with the legacy and celebrating the legacy of Black Studies, I feel like, they have done that well. My second year, at UMass Amherst, I co-organized a graduate student symposium celebrating, the field. And I think that is really important. I was also in attendance at the town hall at the Schomburg Center last night. And Dr. Ward, who is the chair at the CUNY Department of African American Studies, was really good about talking about the importance of making sure students know the legacy, because as we are aware, it's hard to find AP, African American Studies has been under attack, books have been banned, there's this go woke go broke and how woke has been appropriated, but just understanding Black Studies and the radical organizing that it took to get those departments. I feel like we've been good on that, but I'm also interested in maybe to the question, what has it done well? I'm wondering, Frank Willerson asked this question, how do we get from 1968 to here? And do we still have that that same fervor, that same energy, that same those same demands? What are our targets today? Because we had different targets in the 1960s when we're thinking about organizing and voter registration, but we're also seeing how those gains of the 1960s and 70s, Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, how those are currently being struck down. So I'm like, well, what are our targets today? And is Black Studies addressing them, or is it participating in the university in a way that, of course, we're not going to push the needle or push the issue, because we need funding and we need professors and we need students. And so are we towing the line? I'm wondering that. And so I think that's a great question for, I think Black Studies does a good job of giving people their flowers. I think about all the panels that have been, celebrating 20 years of Scenes of Subjection, and, celebrating, the work of Farrah Jasmine Griffin, or celebrating the work of Toni Morrison. I think, Black Studies itself does a good job of that. And so I think these are great questions, but also just thinking about Black Studies and Black Studies professors, and to the question of what has it not done particularly well. I think certain brands of work do the work of repairing and reforming empire and anti-blackness. I'm talking about work within Black studies, right? And I'm thinking, of course, what I was saying earlier about you can track Black studies along Beyonce's album and kind of take a look at some of the articles and CFPs that were coming out, and alongside that, I think it'd be really interesting to really look at those things. I feel like certain brands, and I'm saying brands intentionally, do the work of shoring up gender perhaps as a viable category for Black people, because I'm not of the mind that gender I'm of the mind that gender is anti-Black, right? I'm not convinced about gender, and I feel like sometimes the university or Black studies departments have a certain level of conservatism within them, and so I feel like that they're not embracing perspectives and the works of certain scholars who are trans. I feel like Black studies could do a lot better with that. And this isn't to say that there are no folks who are trans or non-binary that are doing Black studies. There are, but like they're not embraced in the sense that they're just not. And you can talk to them and they may have stories for you, but like my awareness is what I've seen and what I've heard. Those departments could do a lot better job.
And I don't think that those questions that you're talking about are around gender, sexuality questions. I don't think that they've entered the sort of cornerstone foundation part of Black studies as a question. When things remain the margins, that's very even if they're in the margins, that's very different than being located in a really insurgent and disruptive way as a foundational question. Yeah, for sure. So I have a question, and this is in some ways almost like science fiction is an interest of yours, so almost a science fiction question.
Okay.
Thinking about the future, right? And this is really animated for me by the question of what would be the sign of the success of Black studies, because I see sort of two major ways of measuring the future success of Black studies. One is to say, Black studies comes about because intellectual life, the disciplines, were completely absent the study of Black life, and so Black studies becomes the thing that does that. But then, of course, as we know over the decades, and I think this is a real question for the field, we have completely transformed as a field the disciplines, like especially in the humanities, especially English and history, right? History departments, English departments, Black literature and history is an absolute central part of how they conceive themselves. And if we think about that really pushing further and further and further across all the disciplines and saturating in all these new ways, is this ultimate success of Black studies to no longer be needed because the work of transforming the disciplines has been so radically effective, right? We don't need Black studies anymore. In other words, is the ultimate goal of Black studies to dissolve itself? Or the other question is the future of Black studies and its success actually going to be signified by the development of really core methodologies that aren't like any other discipline? Right, for Black studies to have a sense of when you do Black studies work methodologically in terms of critical framings, these are things that actually don't travel. These are things that can't be digested by disciplines, and that we become in that way our own thing. And I've said this in a bunch of podcasts. I'll say it again. I'm looking as I'm sitting here at the Keywords in African American Studies, right? A collection. I forget it's on like NYU Press, I think.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of like primary texts in Black studies, multiple collections, but we don't have a sort of anthology of Black studies methodologies or methodological debates in Black studies. But is that the kind of thing, like if we had that kind of content, things that don't travel, things that aren't digestible by disciplines, is that the success of Black studies, to really just be something completely fully formed like a discipline? Or is it to have transformed the disciplines so that it really in some ways isn't needed?
I want to say, maybe as long as there's an anti-Black world, there will be a need for Black studies. But then also, thinking about success, I, metaphorically speaking, I did
say it was science fiction-y.
Yeah. So like the success part with Black studies, like, and I feel like if we were to take certain theorists and certain, cultural thinkers and objects and artifacts to their logical conclusion, what is the success measured in like a revolution, like an actual revolution, right? Because I feel metaphorically speaking, I if I'm taking Wilderson seriously, that the world is a plantation, right, and the plantation needs to go, and I'm standing here, metaphorically speaking, with the torch and a machete, and then I'm being approached and told, you don't need that. Let's talk about rest. Let's talk about dance or what have you. And not to say that those things are bad, but like those can't be our only conversations. I think we do need to have, and I think this ties into the last question. But we need to have, just thinking about like how success may not be measured in like a 10-year portfolio or like a institution, right? I do imagine that we will see a need perhaps to move beyond educational institutions, and we'll probably need to do some teaching beyond the walls of the university, because as DEI offices are closed, affirmative action has been struck down. I will say I feel that some folks need to put on a clown nose now that they have been a part of getting rid of that. Books have been banned, courses are being banned. We will have to divest from these anti-Black institutions, and so maybe the success is Black studies remaining malleable to a certain extent, that like it can go anywhere, it can travel outside of the institution. Not to say that it hasn't, or there's not some transference outside of the walls of the academy, but maybe we start to think of Black studies as something that is part of the community, and that is tied to organizing. It's tied to the community in a way that is not tied or needs to be tied to the university. That's what I have initially. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a big speculative question. That's why I said it's a kind of science fiction-y. But I mean, part of what motivated it, just I've said this a bunch of times, but there's this Richard Wright essay, "The Literature of the Negro in the United States," and he concludes it, and he's like, if you have noticed a sharp turn towards racial themes in African American literature, it's because of the atrocities of our white neighbors. And he says, if you ever notice that that the Negro writer no longer, writes on racial themes, it's because we've been treated as humans, right?
Yeah.
But when he says that, of course, it's Richard Wright, so it's like if the unimaginable happens, then the unimaginable will happen to our literature.
Yeah.
Right. But he's also like, it'll be an index if in other words, if Black writers stop writing about Black stuff, then you'll know that like white people stop being violent beleaguerers.
Right.
Yeah. And I will say again, I know it's intro podcasty, but I think it's next week or maybe the week after, a podcast with Christina Knight, who's an art historian at Rutgers.
Okay.
Was talking about making a short film that imagined a science fiction futurist film that imagined a world where feminism was not in the dictionary, and just how hard it was to even conceive how you would represent that in a film because it's so unimaginable, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's sort of when that was her response. She was like, I can't really imagine it, but I guess if we're doing futurism, all things are possible. So speaking of the future, there we go. I made a natural segue like a real podcast person. Whatever the sort of status of Black studies today, in some ways, I think you've answered this multiple times, but thinking about the future of the field, what is the one topic? What is the one question that you think we should all be asking?
How long do we want to do this? What is next? Do we want to have a serious conversation about, violence? Like, do we really want to take a close look at, what is contingent violence? What is gratuitous violence? Do we want to think critically about what it means to be at war? Just rehashing the observation that the university itself is also a plantation, and it's also, the intellectual stoke of sorts on the wheel that continues to run recklessly over the global south. So thinking about empire, how the university itself is a part of that intellectual juggernaut that is the empire, right? And then also, do we want to return to that 1968 moment? Like, will we ever reactivate that moment that was 1968? I feel like there have been spurts of it at times, thinking of, maybe the encampments, maybe, the summer of 2020. But, Empire is watching, and Empire is also, pulling the aesthetics of revolution, and Columbia celebrates their protest history, but at the same time they are coming down on professors and students alike right now. And so
that thing is obscene, but
yeah, like just really
Wow.
but if I understand that we're at war, and I will say that I am in the academy first as a teacher and then maybe an artist, but definitely thinking of myself as also a writer and a theorist. But I'm thinking about that article that Joy James wrote, airbrushing the revolution for the sake of abolition, and just really understanding that we're literally at war. And so as much as we want to talk about emotions such as joy, and we want to talk about rest as resistance, and we want to talk about dance and pleasure, we're at war. And so what does it mean to really take that seriously and really see the need to take that seriously? Because something's got to give, right? And so like I think we should definitely be asking questions about the war that we've been fighting, from convict leasing and the war on drugs to the police murders and like the repression that we've seen, COINTELPRO, slavery, all those things were war. And so paraphrasing Joy James, like we need to take that seriously and take those inquiries and those questions seriously in the academy, because otherwise we'll just be absorbed into the university, and we'll just be like the other departments, that radical element, and we become politically defanged because we are just another department on the university.
And when you're listing off those wars, it's been a quick turn in its own way. I mean, it in some ways, as you already suggested multiple times, should have been anticipated or seen in its sort of quiet form. But we're also in a war over Black studies, and what would it mean to actually position ourselves as insurgents, but also insurgents inside empire? Yeah. You raised a lot of really hard questions there. So, but if Black studies can't raise the hardest questions of all, like what's the point of all this, right?
Right. Why do this work?
Well, this has been fantastic, Biko. I mean, I'm so glad you made the time and we got a chance to talk. I just would love this as a chance for you and I to talk, but I'm really happy that this is something people are going to be able to listen to and think about. You've given me a lot to think about. This is a great contribution to our series, and thank you for such thoughtfulness. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I would say this is my first interview as a professor, as Dr. Caruthers, and so I'm definitely going to remember this. So
I love that. Okay, that's as new. That's my. That's going to make me happy, man. I'm happy to be on a part of that. So, but yeah, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.